Hello everyone. I am Mr. Night Crime. I know many of you watched this video to help you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I would love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from, and if you are enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the stories. Story 1. In 2022, a young man named Bryce Brogaw vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only vague clues and countless questions. His girlfriend Cordelia's family couldn't make sense of what had happened, and her father, Michael Ilichis, seemed to know more than he was willing to share. What began as an ordinary missing persons case soon evolved into a dark story of deception, revenge, and desperation. What really happened that fateful day, and how deep do the roots of this mystery go? Stay with us as we uncover the truth hidden behind layers of lies and suspicion. A chilly day in a small town in Minnesota didn't suggest anything out of the ordinary. Mist blanketed the streets, adding a damp chill to the air, and the quiet settlement of Center felt particularly empty. It was here that Bryce was last seen, leaving home and heading toward a storage unit with his girlfriend's father. Cordelia Ilex had recently returned home after months of traveling across the country. She had hoped for a warm reception and a bit of peace. Her family lived here in Minnesota, but instead she found herself at the center of a series of events that sent shivers down her spine. Soon after her return, Cordelia sensed that something wasn't right. Bryce had gone to the storage unit with her father, Michael, to drop off some belongings. The unit was only a few minutes' walk from their house, and the trip should have taken no more than half an hour. But as time passed, Bryce didn't come back. With each passing hour, Cordelia's unease grew. She tried to settle herself after her long journey, took a shower even, but the anxiety refused to fade. Later that day, Michael returned alone. He looked distressed and immediately told Cordelia that Bryce had been detained at the storage facility. Cordelia couldn't understand what was going on. Michael claimed that two dark gray cars had pulled up to them at the storage complex. People who appeared to be some kind of official stepped out, but they didn't show any identification or introduce themselves. Everything happened so fast that Michael didn't have a chance to question them or get a clear understanding of the situation. The individuals restrained Bryce, placed handcuffs on him, and drove away. The cars were nondescript, their headlights piercing through the growing evening fog, and Michael couldn't recall any details that might help identify them. These words left Cordelia stunned. She immediately tried calling Bryce, but his phone was turned off. She sent him messages pleading for him to return and explain what had happened, but no response ever came. With each passing minute, Cordelia's worry grew. On Friday, October 28th, after days without any information, she went to the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office and filed a missing person report. At that point, she had no new details to share with the authorities, apart from Michael's confusing account of events. The police quickly launched an investigation. Detectives examined all the messages Cordelia had sent Bryce on the night he went missing. It was clear from the text that she was panicking, her growing distress evident with every passing hour. Her anxiety seemed to resonate with the investigators as well. What had started as a routine missing persons case began morphing into something far darker and more complicated. Officers questioned Michael Ilichis, but his statements were inconsistent and left many unanswered questions, prompting further interviews. Meanwhile, investigators visited the storage facility where Bryce had last been seen. What they found there only deepened the mystery. A sled, drag marks resembling those left by moving heavy objects, and other pieces of evidence that added an ominous layer to the story. The deeper the police delved into the case, the more unsettling the details became. Bryce Brogaw's disappearance was turning into a full-blown enigma, fraught with fear and uncertainty. Cordelia, initially trusting her father's account, tried to make sense of the situation, but everything around her seemed increasingly bizarre and incomprehensible. Michael Ilichis, fully aware that he'd be the first person the police would call in for questioning after Cordelia's report, attempted to prepare himself. On Friday, October 28th, officers located Michael at a family Halloween party in Brainerd. He agreed to accompany them back to the storage facility and provide a more detailed account of what had happened on the day Bryce went missing. Michael recounted the events, striving to leave no detail out. He explained that he and Bryce had arrived at the storage unit in a white Ford Escape with a trailer to sort through some belongings after the lengthy road trip he and Cordelia had recently taken. The task took about 45 minutes, with Bryce sorting his things to decide what to keep and what to discard. Around 5:45 p.m., they were preparing to leave when something unexpected occurred. As they were getting into the car and pulling out of the storage unit, two dark gray vehicles intercepted them. Michael described the cars as having flashing lights, not the standard ones used by marked patrol cars, but the type typically seen on unmarked law enforcement vehicles. This struck Michael as unusual, raising doubts about the legitimacy of the people inside. According to his account, both he and Bryce were briefly detained by these unidentified individuals. Michael was escorted back to his white Ford Escape, while Bryce was placed in a different vehicle, a dark gray SUV. Michael recalled that the interior of the SUV was unremarkable, except for a small computer mounted on the dashboard. During questioning, Michael described the situation as appearing highly coordinated, involving several individuals. Bryce seemed to realize this wasn't a random event. Before they were separated, Bryce thanked Michael for his help and said nothing more. On the way to the storage unit earlier, they had spoken very little. When Michael asked Bryce about his and Cordelia's trip, Bryce had simply replied that the drive was fine. Both men had been quiet and distant, seemingly uninterested in making conversation. As the investigation continued, hints of tension within the family began to emerge. Michael admitted he was reluctant to spend time with Bryce and felt uneasy around him. Detectives found it curious why Michael had agreed to help Bryce with the storage unit at all, especially without Cordelia being present. Cordelia later explained that she had stayed home because she was exhausted from their long journey and needed time to rest. From Michael's perspective, the trip to the storage unit had been routine until it was interrupted by the unexpected and unsettling encounter. He speculated that the events might be connected to some kind of trouble Bryce had gotten himself into. Having just returned to town after a lengthy road trip across the U.S., Bryce and Cordelia had spent only a few hours together before the disappearance occurred. Michael suspected that whatever had happened might be tied to their recent travels. Despite his growing discomfort, he cooperated fully with law enforcement, sharing every detail he could remember. But the case only grew darker and more perplexing with each passing day. Michael also recalled how suddenly Cordelia had announced her return. Initially, she had called him on a Sunday, saying she and Bryce would be back in about a week. However, by Monday she contacted him again, saying they were coming home that very night due to an unexpected situation. The abrupt change in plans struck Michael as odd, almost as if they had been swept up in something serious and beyond their control, possibly even something criminal. Cordelia and Bryce set off on their road trip right after her graduation in June. For 4 months, they traveled across multiple states, exploring new places, staying in budget motels, and occasionally sleeping in their car. It was a time of freedom without obligations, but a lot could have happened during that period, things that might explain the noticeable change in the dynamics of their relationship upon their return. Michael, Cordelia's father, had a distinct sense that something was off. He noticed subtle but telling details. Cordelia seemed withdrawn, her demeanor more subdued. She had even developed odd habits, like avoiding conversations when Bryce was in the house. After Bryce was taken by unknown individuals, Michael returned home filled with questions. He approached Cordelia, trying to get to the bottom of what had happened. He mentioned that during Bryce's detainment, there was a reference to Arizona. At first, Cordelia tried to brush it off, insisting everything was fine and there was no danger. But her reassurances felt forced, as if she were hiding something. Eventually, under her father's persistent questioning, she admitted that police had intervened a few times in the past. Specifically, officers had been called when she showed up to work with visible bruises on her face. Each time, she downplayed the situation, insisting nothing serious had occurred and declining to press charges. For Michael, this revelation was alarming. It confirmed his fears that there were deeper issues in her relationship with Bryce. He could see that she was afraid to tell the full truth. The previous spring in March, Bryce had come to stay with Cordelia's family for a while. From the moment he arrived, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. At first, the changes were subtle. Minor remarks, awkward silences, and tense interactions that could be dismissed as typical disagreements. But it didn't take long for the conflicts to escalate. One morning, Cordelia came downstairs with a noticeable bruise on her face. When her parents asked what had happened, she claimed she had tripped during a scuffle and hit her face. Michael didn't believe her explanation, but Cordelia was adamant. Another one of Michael's daughters, who had been staying at the house at the time, told him she had heard Cordelia crying in her room that night. This only deepened Michael's concerns. Michael knew something serious was happening in their relationship, but he wasn't sure how to help his daughter. The tension between Bryce and Cordelia grew more intense by the day, with arguments becoming a near daily occurrence. The strain on the household became unbearable, and Michael found himself constantly on edge, worried about what might happen next. After Bryce was detained by unidentified individuals at the storage unit, Michael returned home with a growing sense that the situation was spiraling out of control. He feared that Cordelia might disappear next, or worse, that she had already been taken alongside Bryce. The waiting and uncertainty weighed heavily on him. Unsure of whom to trust or what steps to take, Michael tried to get more information from Cordelia about their recent travels. She mentioned that they had been to Washington State not long ago, which further alarmed him. He also recalled that the individuals who detained Bryce had mentioned Arizona, and Michael knew that Cordelia and Bryce had been in Arizona just weeks earlier. These details only deepened his suspicion that their travels might be tied to something illicit. Michael also shared with the police that Bryce was an avid user of marijuana. This concerned him deeply, as he suspected that involvement with banned substances might have played a role in their problems. He noted another peculiar detail. Both Bryce and Cordelia carried two phones, a standard smartphone and an older flip phone, which could be discarded without leaving a trace if necessary. Investigators were particularly interested in finding Bryce's phones, believing they could hold critical information. However, Michael admitted he didn't know where the phones were. Cordelia also seemed reluctant to talk about them, sidestepping questions and avoiding the topic altogether. Investigators began to develop theories that Bryce's disappearance might have been a staged event or part of an attempt to go into hiding. Certain details suggested that this might have been premeditated. However, Michael doubted Bryce would willingly vanish, especially leaving Cordelia behind in such uncertainty. He believed the situation was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. Cordelia told Michael that she and Bryce had been planning to return to Montana to find work and start over. However, she also revealed troubling aspects of their relationship, describing Bryce as controlling. She confided that he monitored her phones and checked all her emails. Michael saw fear in his daughter, which only heightened his own anxiety. He desperately wanted to help her, but it was clear she wasn't ready to fully open up about what had really been happening between her and Bryce. Investigators discovered that Bryce had been monitoring Cordelia's phone activity. He insisted that all her devices be connected to his so he could track her contacts and review every message and call. As part of the investigation, the police asked Michael to provide his phone to verify location data and confirm where he had been on Wednesday evening, the last time Bryce was seen. Michael explained that after leaving the storage facility, he returned home, drove to Brainerd, and even visited his uncle. However, inconsistencies began to emerge in his account. The situation grew increasingly complex. Initially, it seemed as though Bryce and Cordelia were on the run from the authorities, resembling a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde traveling across the country. On the other hand, there were clear tensions between Bryce and Cordelia's father, Michael, who had openly expressed mistrust and dislike for him. To unravel the truth, investigators delved deeper into the Ilex family dynamics and the relationship between Bryce and Cordelia. Cordelia and Bryce met in February 2022, brought together by a shared love of dogs and a mutual thirst for adventure. In June 2022, just after her high school graduation, Cordelia and Bryce set off on a cross-country trip seeking freedom from the constraints of her parents. Part of Cordelia's desire to leave stemmed from the atmosphere at home. She felt her parents were overly controlling. In the past, they had even hired a private investigator to follow her previous boyfriend. Adding to the family tension, Cordelia's mother was battling Huntington's disease, and her younger sibling, who had recently come out as transgender, was facing challenges of their own. Cordelia was a strong supporter of her sibling, but her primary source of stress was her father, Michael, whose relentless pressure made life at home unbearable. Michael Ilitch was born in Pitt Lakes, a suburb of Brainerd, in 1977. His parents divorced when he was young, and his mother remarried, later having more children in her second marriage. Michael grew up with his younger half-siblings, graduated from high school in 1996, and eventually moved to the small town of Center, where he initially worked in construction. Later, he transitioned to self-employment, doing odd jobs for neighbors. Michael was deeply family-oriented, as evidenced by a tattoo on his arm that read "Daddy's Girl" alongside an image of his daughters. Investigators circled back to Michael about Bryce's phone 10 minutes after his initial denial. At first, Michael insisted he had never handled the phone. However, he eventually admitted that he had taken it from the car and thrown it away in a trash bin at a gas station in Brainerd that same evening. He explained his actions by saying he was trying to protect his daughter. Michael confessed that he was terrified by the situation and worried that someone might track Bryce's phone and endanger Cordelia. Bryce Brogaw was born in Brainerd in September 1999. At the time of his disappearance, he was 23 years old and full of dreams. Bryce aspired to build a yurt in Alaska and create a self-sufficient farm. The road trip with Cordelia was part of his quest for freedom and a life connected to nature. Their relationship had started in February 2022, and the trip symbolized their shared vision of an independent remote lifestyle. During interrogations, investigators worked to piece together the fragments of this increasingly contradictory story. While the couple's journey across the country initially appeared idyllic, deeper issues began to surface, including family conflicts and strained relationships. Investigators pressed with questions, trying to unravel what had really happened between Cordelia, Bryce, and her family. Michael claimed that his actions were motivated by fear for his daughter's safety. But inconsistencies in his accounts led investigators to suspect he might be hiding something or perhaps didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation himself. Standing outside the storage complex, Michael spoke with investigators, expressing both his anguish and helplessness. He explained that he had been struggling for some time to come to terms with the circumstances his daughter was caught in. Michael was forthcoming about his concerns, describing his deep unease with Bryce's behavior. He suspected that Cordelia had experienced mistreatment at Bryce's hands. According to Michael, Bryce exerted control over nearly every aspect of Cordelia's life, leaving her feeling humiliated and powerless. Michael admitted that witnessing this dynamic was deeply painful for him as a father. He believed Cordelia needed to decide for herself to end the relationship, but he also confessed that he had sometimes considered scaring Bryce into staying away from her. Michael told investigators that thoughts of revenge had crossed his mind, especially when he saw how Bryce controlled her. Despite these feelings, he insisted that he didn't want to take illegal actions and had been doing his best to protect his family through lawful means. In 1999, Michael already had legal troubles. At 21, he pleaded guilty to third-degree criminal conduct and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. This incident was a major wake-up call for him, and he tried to turn his life around to avoid similar issues in the future. However, in February 2018, Michael found himself embroiled in another legal case when he was convicted of fourth-degree misconduct involving an adult who had been declared mentally incapacitated. Initially, this individual had declined to engage in any intimate relationship with Michael, but eventually complied after repeated pressure from him. As part of the investigation, Michael underwent 4 polygraph tests and claimed to have passed all of them, which he believed supported his innocence. Investigators explained to Michael that polygraph results are not admissible in Minnesota courts and cannot be used as evidence. Passing the test didn't automatically prove innocence, though it could contribute to perceived credibility. Michael, familiar with the process, insisted he understood how polygraphs worked and pointed to his past successes as proof of his honesty. He leaned heavily on these results in an attempt to convince investigators of his truthfulness. In counseling sessions, Michael attended to address his personal issues. He often discussed his desire to protect his family. His concerns extended not only to Cordelia, but also to his younger daughter. He expressed a strong sense of responsibility for their well-being and was determined to do whatever it took to ensure their safety. Michael feared the possibility of incarceration, knowing it would leave him unable to care for his daughters. He recognized the need to tread carefully to avoid further harm to his family. Michael had confronted Bryce several times after noticing bruises on Cordelia's face. He had warned Bryce repeatedly, saying that if he saw any more signs of harm, he wouldn't just issue verbal threats. These conversations were tense, and Michael did not hide his anger. However, he defended himself to investigators, claiming that resorting to aggression against Bryce wouldn't improve the situation. He emphasized that it was ultimately up to Cordelia to recognize the unhealthy nature of her relationship and make the decision to leave. During his interviews with police, Michael frequently expressed mistrust of Bryce and often spoke about him in the past tense. He described Bryce as arrogant and prone to boasting about his supposed achievements. Michael believed that people like Bryce often struggled to handle real-life challenges and dismissed him as a fool who didn't understand the consequences of his actions. Investigators continued to analyze every aspect of the case, striving to untangle the web of contradictions and uncover the truth. The atmosphere during interrogations was tense, with each new detail adding further complexity to an already confusing narrative. Michael tried to cooperate with the investigation, but admitted he didn't have all the answers. Detectives worked to piece together the fragments of the story, which seemed increasingly contradictory. Michael's past offenses appeared to be of an entirely different nature than the suspected circumstances surrounding Bryce Brogau's disappearance just 2 days earlier. Suspicion loomed over Michael, especially after he admitted to having threatened Bryce and wanting him to stay away from his daughter. 2 days before Bryce's body was discovered, 2 of Michael Ilich's half-brothers went to the police with shocking information. They claimed that Michael had confessed to a crime. Michael allegedly spoke with his sister, Jen Baker, whom he had visited earlier that evening at a Halloween party. According to Jen, Michael asked to borrow her car, explaining that he feared police were watching his truck. When Jen pressed him on why he needed the vehicle, Michael admitted that he was planning to bury Bryce's body. He reportedly told her that he had shot Bryce in the back of the head and used a sled to move the body as it was too heavy to carry. Michael also mentioned grabbing a bag of leaves from her garage to help disguise the burial site. On October 29th, police obtained a warrant to search Michael's storage unit. Inside, they found a bottle of bleach on the concrete floor. Forensic analysis revealed traces of both Bryce's and Michael's DNA on the bottle. Investigators also discovered residue that tested positive for the presence of blood, as well as drag marks consistent with something heavy being moved using a sled. The sled was later found discarded in a roadside ditch near the storage facility, covered with a blanket. It bore dried residue that appeared to be blood. When investigators examined Michael's phone records, they uncovered damning evidence. On October 27th, the day after Bryce's disappearance, Michael had left his house at 4:45 a.m. and driven to his storage unit. He stayed there for 22 minutes before heading to a section of public land near Edward Lake, where he remained for another hour. These movements heightened investigators' suspicions that the storage unit had been the site of a crime. On October 30th, following location data from Michael's phone, police arrived at a wooded area near Edward Lake. The site was isolated, deep in the wilderness, and unlikely to be stumbled upon by accident. The ground showed signs of recent digging with broken branches stuck into the soil and freshly scattered leaves that didn't match the surrounding foliage. It was clear that someone had attempted to conceal the area, but the effort was poorly executed. When an excavation team began their work, they uncovered a body buried beneath the soil. It was Bryce Brogel, and he had been shot in the back of the head. Michael quickly became the prime suspect after the discovery of Bryce's body, a development that didn't surprise investigators. It also came to light that on October 26th, Michael had taken a firearm from his half-sister, Jen's house, telling her he needed it to deal with a rodent problem at a work site. Shortly after, Bryce and Cordelia returned to Minnesota. Michael took Bryce to the storage unit, allegedly intending to provoke an argument that could lead to a report being filed against Bryce, which Michael believed would keep him away from Cordelia. According to Michael, he had the gun with him that day because he had been dealing with pests earlier. During a heated exchange, Michael accused Bryce of mistreating Cordelia. Bryce allegedly responded by claiming Cordelia belonged to him and threatening to harm her if anyone tried to take her away. Michael claimed that he fired the gun in a moment of rage, believing he was protecting his daughter. As the investigation progressed, evidence pointed to premeditation. Bryce and Cordelia's landlord in Washington state revealed that Michael had called him, asking if Bryce had ever harmed his daughter. The landlord mentioned that he had seen Cordelia with visible bruises. Michael reportedly responded by saying he planned to kill Bryce and had already dug a grave. These claims were corroborated by Michael's half-brother, who told investigators he had heard similar threats. In July 2022, just a month after starting the road trip with Bryce, Cordelia had begged Michael to come get her. However, she didn't disclose her location and later told him everything was fine. After that, her complaints stopped. Despite this, Michael remained deeply concerned for his daughter, especially when he noticed bruises on her, which she either denied or attributed to accidents. Family members suspected Michael believed Bryce was responsible for harming Cordelia. The fatal shot at the storage unit, the use of a sled to transport Bryce's body to the woods, and the haphazard attempt to conceal the burial all pointed to a plan that Michael had thought through but executed poorly. He had cleaned the storage unit, buried Bryce's body, and tried to hide the evidence. But it wasn't enough to evade capture. In November 2022, Michael was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, a crime committed without premeditation but still intentional under the law. On March 30, 2023, the charges against Michael were elevated to first-degree murder, and a grand jury formally indicted him. The trial began in 2024. Throughout the court proceedings, Cordelia maintained that her relationship with Bryce was not abusive and stated that she had been happy with him. Her social media posts seemed to support this claim. Following her father's arrest on October 31st, she wrote that she had lost a special person who had been her guardian angel. She continued to share memories of Bryce online, never aligning herself with Michael's version of events. During the trial, Michael admitted to killing Bryce, but denied that it was premeditated. He claimed that he acted impulsively, driven by a need to protect his daughter. However, the jury did not find his explanation credible. In April 2024, Michael was convicted of first-degree murder with premeditation, along with an additional second-degree murder charge. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the trial, Cordelia continued to post about Bryce on social media, sharing her thoughts and memories of him. In March 2024, she wrote about how often she thought of Bryce and how much she missed him. The story of Michael Ilitch and Bryce Brogel is a tragic example of how deep-seated suspicion and a lack of trust can lead to irreversible consequences. Michael, as a father, was unable to control his emotions and fears, which drove him to commit a horrific crime. His actions, fueled by fear and anger, resulted in the death of a young man and the destruction of his own daughter's life. The jury rejected his defense, and Michael received a life sentence. This case serves as a stark reminder of the importance of resolving conflicts peacefully and fostering trust with loved ones, rather than resorting to destructive actions born from anger or suspicion. Story 2. The cobblestone streets of Dubrovnik, usually humming with tourists admiring the ancient city walls and crystal-clear Adriatic waters, had taken on an unusually somber tone as the autumn rains blurred the bright colors of the terracotta rooftops. Beneath the city's picturesque facade, a darker undercurrent had begun to swell, one that threatened to unravel the fragile peace Croatia had fought hard to maintain since its turbulent past. Detective Marko Petrovic had been tracking this shadow for months, following a trail of whispers, anonymous tips, and uneasy alliances that pointed to a sprawling network of organized crime. It wasn't the petty thefts or occasional drug busts that had caught his attention, but a sophisticated syndicate with roots deep enough to infiltrate local politics, law enforcement, and the burgeoning tourist industry that was the city's lifeblood. Marco's investigation had begun almost by accident, sparked by a quiet complaint from a hotel manager about missing shipments of luxury goods, high-end watches, designer jewelry, and rare wines. Initially dismissed as isolated thefts, the pattern soon emerged as part of a much larger operation. The stolen items were funneled through a series of underground contacts, eventually reaching markets far beyond Croatia's borders, spanning from the Balkans to Western Europe. But what unsettled Marko most was the involvement of a shadowy figure known only by the alias Krau, or the King. A criminal mastermind whose identity remained shrouded in mystery despite the detectives' best efforts. The King's empire was built on intimidation, bribery, and a ruthless efficiency that left little room for error. Crossing him meant disappearing without a trace. As Marko delved deeper, he uncovered unsettling ties between the syndicate and several high-profile individuals in Dubrovnik's elite circles. Businessmen, politicians, and even members of the cultural establishment who profited from the illicit trade or turned a blind eye. Corruption was woven into the city's social fabric, a toxic thread threatening to unravel years of progress. Each interview Marko conducted was a delicate dance of suspicion and diplomacy, where a wrong word or misplaced trust could blow the case wide open, or end his career. The detective's own team was stretched thin, battling not only criminals but skepticism and apathy within their ranks. It was clear that taking down the king would require more than just evidence. It would demand courage, strategy, and a willingness to confront forces far more powerful than any one man. Amid the growing tension, a grim incident jolted the investigation. A young journalist named Anna Kovac was found dead in her apartment, the apparent victim of an overdose that police quickly ruled accidental. But Marco's instincts told him otherwise. Anna had been working on an expose about the king's operations, gathering documents and testimonies that threatened to expose the syndicate's entire network. The timing of her death was suspicious, and subtle signs at the scene suggested she had been followed and threatened in the days before. Marco pushed for a more thorough inquiry despite political pressure to close the case quietly, determined to uncover the truth behind Anna's demise. Her death became a catalyst, galvanizing the detective and his team to intensify their efforts, aware that the cost of failure could be far greater than they imagined. The investigation soon revealed the extent of the king's reach, smuggling routes hidden along the Dalmatian coast, safe houses disguised as tourist villas, and corrupt officials turning a blind eye in exchange for hefty bribes. Surveillance operations were mounted, wiretaps installed, and undercover agents deployed, each step fraught with risk. Marco often found himself navigating the labyrinthine alleys of Dubrovnik at night, shadowed by threats both visible and invisible. The detective's personal life frayed under the pressure. Late nights and constant vigilance left little time for family or respite. Yet the image of Anna, brave, determined, silenced, remained a haunting motivator. The line between justice and revenge blurred, but Marco knew he had to stay true to the law, even as it seemed to bend beneath the weight of deceit. In the heart of this turmoil, Marco discovered an unexpected ally in Lena Novak, a local historian whose expertise on Dubrovnik's secret passages and old trade routes proved invaluable. Lena's knowledge of the underground tunnels and hidden coves provided the team with new avenues to intercept shipments and surveil suspects. Her quiet strength and sharp intellect brought balance to Marco's intensity, and a cautious friendship blossomed amidst the shadows of danger. Together, they pieced together a puzzle that spanned decades, revealing that the king's criminal enterprise was not only about smuggling, but also about controlling the flow of power in a city where past and present collided. As the evidence mounted, the question lingered. Would they be able to strike before the king's forces silenced them all? The deeper Marco and Lena dug into the labyrinth of criminal activities, the clearer it became that this syndicate operated not just on greed, but on a precise strategy of control and fear. Their power was built through decades of exploiting Croatia's fragile transition from war-torn recovery to hopeful prosperity. The syndicate's roots stretched back to the 1990s, when shadowy paramilitary groups had seized opportunities amid chaos, morphing into a clandestine cartel that had survived political shifts and economic reforms. This history was etched into the city itself, in forgotten tunnels beneath the old town, and in silent agreements made behind closed doors. As Marco reviewed piles of intercepted communications and coded ledgers, he realized that the king had mastered the art of invisibility. An elusive puppet master whose fingers touched every major smuggling route, money laundering front, and political alliance without ever revealing his face. One night, after a long day of surveillance on a suspected drop-off point near the port, Marco found himself alone in a small cafe on the edge of the old town. The scent of roasted coffee beans mixed with the salty air, as he flipped through Anna's last notes. Handwritten observations, cryptic but revealing. She had identified a pattern in the shipments, a coded sequence of deliveries timed with the arrival of tourist boats, exploiting the seasonal influx to mask illicit goods. It was a stroke of criminal genius, using the city's lifeblood, tourism, as cover for smuggling weapons, drugs, and stolen artifacts. Marco's mind raced with the implications. If they could intercept the next shipment, they might finally expose the king's identity and bring down the entire network. But the stakes were higher than ever, and the risk of discovery meant they were playing a deadly game of cat and mouse. Lena joined Marco at the cafe just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ancient stone streets. She brought news from her latest research, a lead on a safe house hidden in a forgotten quarter of Dubrovnik. A place where shipments were repackaged and contacts exchanged under the guise of legitimate business. It was risky to act on incomplete information, but waiting meant giving the king more time to cover his tracks. The two agreed to coordinate a covert raid, hoping to catch the syndicate off guard. As they planned, Marco couldn't shake a growing unease. The syndicate was more dangerous than anyone had realized, and the corruption ran deeper, threatening to undermine their efforts from within. A mole in the police force, perhaps, or someone high up feeding information back to the king's operatives. Trust was a scarce commodity. The night of the raid arrived cloaked in fog, the Adriatic breeze carrying the distant sound of waves crashing against the fortress walls. Marco's team moved swiftly, silent but deadly, through narrow alleys and past shuttered shops. Their target was a dilapidated warehouse near the city's edge, abandoned in daylight but transformed after dark into a hive of illicit activity. As they breached the building, the detectives were met with resistance. Armed guards who fired blindly into the darkness, desperate to protect their master's interests. The firefight was chaotic and intense, the echoes bouncing off stone walls and metal containers. Despite the danger, Marco pressed forward, driven by the urgency to uncover the truth. Inside, they found crates filled with smuggled artifacts, forged documents, and encrypted drives holding records of transactions and communications. It was a treasure trove of evidence, but also a grim reminder of how much had been lost to greed and violence. Among the detainees was a mid-level lieutenant of the syndicate, a man known as Raid, whose fear and desperation spilled secrets about the inner workings of the king's operation. Under careful interrogation, Raid revealed chilling details. The syndicate's involvement in human trafficking, the manipulation of local elections through intimidation and bribery, and the use of offshore accounts to launder millions of euros. Most alarming was the mention of a planned high-profile assassination intended to eliminate a vocal politician advocating anti-corruption reforms. The web of crime was not merely about profit. It was a tool to maintain absolute control, silencing opposition, and preserving a shadow government. Marco's resolve hardened. They were no longer just fighting criminals. They were confronting a force that threatened the very soul of Croatia's democracy. The raid's success sent ripples through the city, emboldening some and terrifying others. Media outlets cautiously reported on the operation, careful not to name the king, but hinting at a growing scandal. Public opinion began to shift, with citizens demanding transparency and justice. But with increased visibility came increased danger. Marco's own life was put at risk. Anonymous threats arrived at his doorstep, and a car he once trusted was sabotaged to send a clear message: back off or face consequences. The lines between friend and foe blurred as the syndicate struck back, exploiting the vulnerabilities in a system still healing from years of instability. Yet, amidst the turmoil, the alliance between Marco and Lena deepened, their shared purpose forging a bond stronger than fear. They became a beacon of hope in a city shadowed by corruption and violence, determined to bring the king to light, no matter the cost. The months that followed the raid were marked by a tense, relentless pursuit of the king. With every new piece of evidence uncovered, Marco and his team peeled back layers of deception, revealing a sprawling empire built on fear, influence, and brutality. Yet despite their growing arsenal of proof, the king remained elusive, a ghost slipping through cracks in the justice system, and disappearing into shadows just out of reach. The detective realized that exposing him would require more than surveillance and arrests. It demanded a bold, calculated strike, one that would dismantle the syndicate's core and sever the ties binding it to Croatia's political and economic elite. Lena continued to serve as Marco's invaluable partner. Her knowledge of Dubrovnik's hidden geography, providing the team with unconventional methods to approach and surveil suspects. Together, they devised a plan to infiltrate a secret meeting rumored to be held on a secluded island in the Dalmatian archipelago, a gathering of the king's highest-ranking operatives. The operation was fraught with risk. If caught, they would not only lose their chance to bring down the syndicate but potentially their lives. Undercover agents were positioned strategically, while Marco and Lena prepared to join the meeting disguised as intermediaries. The tension was palpable, a mix of fear, adrenaline, and determination fueling their every move. The island itself was a world away from the bustling city. Its tranquil beaches and dense pine forests a stark contrast to the dangerous game being played beneath its serene surface. The meeting took place in a luxurious villa, guarded by armed men and equipped with state-of-the-art security systems. As Marco and Lena navigated the villa's labyrinthine corridors, they encountered familiar faces. Some old allies turned foes, others unknown players in the criminal network. Every step brought them closer to the king but also deeper into danger. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion and paranoia. Trust was scarce, and betrayal could strike at any moment. When the meeting finally commenced, Marco's heart pounded as he observed the men discuss shipments, finances, and political bribes, unaware that the law was now watching them closely. Suddenly, the operation was compromised. A lookout spotted the undercover agents and chaos erupted. Shots were fired, alarms blared, and the once calm island turned into a battlefield. Marco and Lena fought to escape, using the villa's secret passages and the island's rugged terrain to evade capture. The firefight was brutal, leaving several suspects arrested, but the king nowhere to be found. The failure was bitter, yet illuminating. The king's escape confirmed the necessity of rooting out his network entirely, dismantling every connection that allowed him to move freely. Marco knew that the true victory would come not from one raid or one arrest, but from sustained pressure and the courage of those willing to stand against corruption. Back in Dubrovnik, the public's patience was wearing thin. Protests erupted, demanding transparency and an end to the shadowy influence strangling their city. Marco faced mounting political pressure, accusations of incompetence, and threats from unknown sources. Yet, he refused to back down, inspired by Anna's legacy and the hope that justice could prevail. With Lena's help, he coordinated a series of arrests targeting corrupt officials, business magnates, and police officers complicit in the king's schemes. These actions fractured the syndicate, forcing its members into hiding and disrupting their operations. Though the king himself remained at large, the walls of his empire were beginning to crumble. The story culminated one rainy night, months later, when an informant led Marco to a secluded mansion on the outskirts of Zagreb. The tip was risky, possibly a trap, but it was the best lead yet. Marco approached with caution, his team in tow, and after a tense standoff, they apprehended a man whose identity matched all descriptions of the king. The arrest sent shock waves through Croatia and beyond, signaling a turning point in the battle against organized crime. In the interrogation that followed, fragments of truth emerged: confessions, coded messages, and revelations about the syndicate's plans. While many questions remained, the grip of fear began to loosen, and a battered but hopeful city started to envision a future free from the shadows that had loomed for so long. Marco stood by the Adriatic shore days later, watching the sun rise over the horizon, its light piercing through the mist, and casting a golden glow on Dubrovnik's ancient walls. The fight was far from over, and scars would linger, but the city was beginning to heal. He thought of Anna, of Lena, and of every colleague who had risked everything for justice. The king's reign might have been broken, but the true victory lay in the resilience of those who dared to face darkness head-on. In the quiet moments before the city awoke, Marco felt a rare sense of peace, knowing that sometimes, even in the darkest places, hope could survive and justice could prevail. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. Shadows beneath the Himalayas. The mist hung low over Kathmandu like a curtain refusing to rise, smothering the ancient city beneath a blanket of damp uncertainty. In the alleys behind Durbar Square, the vibrant pulse of Nepal's capital still beat in the early morning hush. Vendors were setting up their carts, incense wafted from temples, and prayer wheels turned slowly in the hands of monks moving like shadows. But not all shadows in Kathmandu belong to the holy or the harmless. Some belong to those who thrived in the lawless crevices of the city, weaving between the cracks of bureaucracy and tradition, like venom through an old wound. Detective Arun Dahal had seen enough of them to know that behind the city's spiritual facade, a different Nepal was emerging. One governed not by prayers or politicians, but by quiet men with loud money, foreign interests, and blood-soaked hands. It had begun with the girl. Her name was Sushmita, 17. A promising student from Bhaktapur with a scholarship to study medicine in Pokhara. Her body was found on the bank of the Bagmati River, shrouded in white linen, her throat cleanly slit, a single red rose pressed into her palm. The newspapers ran the story briefly, blaming local thugs, perhaps a jilted lover. But Arun knew better. This wasn't random. It was ritual. And ritual meant message. Someone had killed the girl not only to silence her, but to speak to those who understood the language of fear. Arun had spent 15 years on the Kathmandu police force, and in that time he had learned that when a murder is meant to send a message, it never ends with one victim. It's only the beginning. The crime scene itself was oddly meticulous. There were no signs of struggle, no drag marks. Her shoes were clean, the soles unworn. She hadn't walked here. She'd been placed, deliberately, carefully, like an offering. The rose? Not native. Imported. The linen? Silk blend expensive. Often used in ceremonial funerals of the elite. Arun stood there, silent beneath the gray sky, while the of the city picked up and the forensics team moved around like ghosts. He didn't trust the forensic chief. Bajarai was too quick, too eager to dismiss the odd details, always pushing the blame toward convenient scapegoats like gang disputes or domestic squabbles. But Arun had seen the pattern. And he remembered another body from 6 months ago, same pose, same rows, but hushed up when the victim turned out to be the son of a foreign diplomat. He began his investigation the only way he knew how, by walking. Through Thamil's neon labyrinth, past the steel skeletons of half-finished buildings, and into the silence of abandoned prayer halls, where whispers of corruption traveled faster than the wind down the Himalayas. People talked when Arun was near, and not because he forced them to. His presence was heavy, his eyes held weight. He wasn't corrupt, and in Kathmandu that made him dangerous. That also made him alone. One night, under the flickering light of a tea house, a former informant named Jay passed Arun a name scribbled on a cigarette carton. Naban Rana. A broker, well-dressed and well-protected, with ties to the trafficking routes running through the Terai, straight across the Indian border. Girls' artifacts, ivory, opium, whatever sold, Naban moved it. Rana wasn't hard to find. His office was perched above a money exchange near the tourist district, hidden in plain sight. Arun climbed the narrow stairs in silence, stepping past flickering neon and the stale scent of fried momo. The office was too clean, too precise. Glass desks, imported whiskey, a framed photo of Mount Everest behind Rana's head, as though the man claimed the mountain as his own. "Detective," Rana said with a smile too white to trust. "Comfort, tea or trouble?" Arun didn't answer. He simply dropped the folder on the desk. Susmita's photo stared up from it, lifeless and cold. Rana didn't blink. Sad. Tragic. But you know how these things are, girls from small towns fall into the wrong crowd. His voice was syrupy, dismissive, the kind used by men who had never been told no. Arun leaned in. "She never made it to the city. Someone intercepted her. Someone like you." The tension thickened. For a moment, it seemed like Rona might call in his guards or pull a weapon. Instead he laughed. "Detective, I am a businessman. And business is very good. But if you keep chasing ghosts, you'll end up one of them." Arun left without a word, but not without a warning. In Nepal, power wasn't worn, it was whispered. And the whispers around Rana were growing louder. That night, someone broke into Arun's apartment. Nothing was taken. But his family photo, his late wife and his son, had been torn in half and left on his pillow. A message. Arun knew the girl's death was connected to something bigger, something international. Nepal had become a transit zone for trafficking, a crossroad for Southeast Asia's worst exports. Foreign investors came with clean suits and dirty hands, laundering money through resorts and casinos, paying off officials with favors wrapped in silk. And in the center of it all, men like Rana flourished. The more Arun dug, the more names surfaced: an NGO falsely claiming to rescue street children, a tourism company offering exclusive adventures, a shipping firm with no ships. Each was a piece of a puzzle that painted a picture no one wanted to see. A trafficking syndicate hiding behind the facade of development and aid, feeding on the vulnerable with impunity. But Arun wasn't finished. He returned to Bhaktapur and met Sushmita's family, simple people, grief-stricken but proud. Her mother handed him a diary wrapped in cloth. She wrote everything, she whispered. Inside were names, dates, hints at meetings she'd overheard at a school event, and a name circled in red ink. Project Lakshmi. Arun didn't sleep that night. Instead, he lit a cigarette, stared into the dark Kathmandu skyline, and realized that this case wasn't about one girl. It was about hundreds, maybe thousands. And if he was going to break it open, he would have to become something more than just a detective. He would have to become a threat. Kathmandu's skies had grown darker since Sushmita's murder. Monsoon clouds hung heavy, threatening more than just rain. Detective Arun Dahal moved through the streets like a man possessed. The diary in his coat pocket, a holy book of corruption, too sacred to lose and too damning to reveal without caution. The name Project Lakshmi echoed through his thoughts like a haunting mantra. That phrase wasn't just scrawled in a dead girl's journal. It was tied to financial records from shell NGOs, whispered by scared informants, and scribbled in coded emails between ministries and foreign contacts. But still, no one in his department wanted to speak of it. When he first showed the notes to his superior, Superintendent Mara only glanced at them, eyes flicking briefly before looking away. "You're chasing shadows, Dahal," he muttered. "Let it go. You're good at catching pickpockets and murderers. This isn't your level." But Arun couldn't. Not when the faces of so many missing girls, faceless and file photos, blurred into one long silent scream. He drove out of the city 2 days after receiving a tip about a rehabilitation retreat in the Makwamper district. On paper, it was listed under a development project managed by a Western-funded foundation. In practice, it was anything but. Hidden behind a tall fence topped with rusted barbed wire and nestled among the forested hills, the compound looked serene to the casual eye. Fresh paint, a carved wooden sign reading Lakshmi Ashram, and prayer flags fluttering in deceptive peace. But the silence inside was wrong. Too still. Too forced. The girls Irun found there did not speak. Some flinched at touch. Others stared blankly at walls as if trying to forget the shape of the men who brought them here. A matron with a crisp accent and a frozen smile tried to usher him out. "All proper, all legal. We have permission from the Ministry of Social Welfare. Perhaps you'd like to make an appointment." But Arun had come with no warrant and no intention of leaving quietly. He stepped through doors, opened file cabinets, and took what he needed, a list of names. Susmita's was on it, dated 6 months before her death. A different name had been scribbled next to hers in blue ink, client, C. J. Renault. That name meant nothing to the matron, or so she claimed. But Arun knew that foreign buyers often worked through intermediaries, and this name, this man, was a window into an international sickness hidden beneath Nepal's surface. Back in Kathmandu, Arun traced the Renault name to a luxury lodge near Phewah Lake in Pokhara, registered to a French national with diplomatic immunity, and a suspicious record of humanitarian projects across Southeast Asia. Each project left behind a trail of missing women and abandoned foundations. Arun's hands trembled as he looked at the satellite photos, the fake adoption forms, the money transfers from numbered accounts in Dubai and Zurich. This wasn't just a ring. It was a machine polished and well-fed, oiled with bribes and masked by philanthropic lies. And yet, every time he tried to bring someone in, a wall of silence met him. Ministers refused meetings. Prosecutors stalled cases. One day, his own precinct locker had been emptied. Files, photos, notes all vanished. And then came the threat, direct and brutal. A white envelope slipped under his apartment door, containing a single photo. His son Milan stepping out of his school, circled in red ink. The message was clear. Stop digging or lose what's left. Arun stared at the photo, his chest tightening with the helpless rage of a man too far in to retreat, but too alone to charge forward. He sat in silence that night, listening to the rain claw at the windows, the old city crying out in waterlogged fury. He remembered what his wife used to say before cancer took her. This country is like a wound that doesn't want to heal. But someone has to be the stitch. He decided then, soaked in guilt and resolve, that he would no longer play by their rules. If the law couldn't carry justice, he would. If the media wouldn't shout the truth, he would scream it in action. And so he began to move differently, off the books, into the shadows where his enemies lived. He used old contacts from the Civil War days. Rebels turned businessmen, soldiers turned smugglers, men who owed him favors and knew how to stay quiet. With their help, he compiled dossiers on Project Lakshmi, leaking select names to sympathetic journalists, feeding whispers into foreign embassies, threatening exposure unless someone powerful started bleeding. A week later, the first corpse was found. Naban Rana, the broker with the white smile, was discovered in his luxury apartment, suffocated with a silk shawl, a red rose stuffed in his mouth. The press called it a suicide. Arun knew better. It was a warning from those above Rana. And yet, it felt like justice in its rawest form. 2 days after, the Lakshmi Ashram mysteriously caught fire. 3 girls were injured. 1 staff member died. The investigation? Labeled accidental electrical fault. But Arun had already evacuated the girls before it happened, sending them to monasteries deep in the hills where even money could not follow. He didn't sleep much anymore. He barely ate. But the fire had drawn international attention. And with pressure mounting, the government could no longer pretend ignorance. An internal investigation was launched, superficial and slow, but a crack in the dam nonetheless. Arun knew he had only one move left, to expose Renault. Not just through law but through spectacle. He flew to Pokhara under an alias, broke into the man's estate with help from a local journalist, and stole the hard drives. Dozens of folders filled with transactional records, photos of victims cataloged like property, encrypted messages with code names linked to officials in Kathmandu, Bangkok, and Geneva. Arun sent it all, anonymously, to a European human rights tribunal and 3 major newspapers. He knew he would be traced. He knew his time was running short. But the story broke like a wave. Humanitarian horror. French diplomat tied to Nepal trafficking ring. And it could no longer be hidden. Protests filled the streets. Renault vanished overnight, and so did several local ministers. But Arun? He stayed. He stayed not for glory, but because someone had to stand between the silence and the scream. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. The Vineyard Pact. In the sweltering heat of the Andalusian summer, the hills of La Rioja rolled out like a golden blanket, each vineyard a carefully cultivated secret. Among them stood the estate of Bodega del Silencio, an isolated winery with a reputation as refined as its Tempranillo, earthy, dark, and deceptively smooth. The owner, Don Mateo Ferrer, was as much a myth as the land he owned. Once a bullfighter of some fame. Now a reclusive vintner with a shadowy past and enough wealth to keep the curious at bay. But beneath the rows of vines and rustic charm of the stone villa, lay something else, something darker fermenting beyond barrels and bottles. And in July of 2020, when the body of a Catalan journalist named Eva Soler was discovered at the base of a ravine not far from the estate, the carefully constructed illusion of peace began to rot. Eva had come to Rioja from Barcelona weeks earlier, posing as a wine blogger with an interest in the heritage and craftsmanship of Spanish winemaking. In truth, she had been investigating whispers of money laundering through boutique vineyards, using inflated bottle prices and dummy exports to wash millions in dirty cash. Money traced back to Eastern European gunrunners and a cartel operating out of Ceuta. The names she had scribbled in her worn notebook included financiers, judges, and more than one elected official. But the one name she circled 3 times, underlined twice, and shaded in red was Ferrer. Her last call, made just before her body was found, was to her editor in Madrid. She had said, breathless and scared, "I have it. I have proof, audio ledgers, everything. But I think they know." Then static. Then silence. When police recovered her body, her phone was gone. Her laptop was shattered. And yet, the official report listed it as accidental. An unfortunate hiking fall in unfamiliar terrain. Closed within days. But not everyone was convinced. Inspector Luis Arellano had seen enough staged accidents in his career to smell the truth buried beneath bureaucracy. He wasn't from Rioja. He'd been assigned from Seville to track a network of art thefts with suspected links to international laundering. But Eva's death struck a chord deeper than he admitted. He had known her once, long ago, before the world hardened both of them into wary skeptics. That connection, unspoken and buried, now reawakened a sense of duty too sharp to ignore. Ariana requested access to the crime scene and was denied. He filed again and was transferred. He filed again, quietly, this time under a different pretext, and finally arrived in Haro under the guise of investigating stolen antiquities rumored to pass through Bodega del Silencio as shipping cover. What he found was a vineyard almost too perfect. Don Mateo greeted him with the hospitality of a practiced host, aged hands firm, eyes unreadable, voice like aged wood. "Of course, Inspector. You are welcome here. We have nothing to hide," he said, gesturing to the rows of vines and the gleaming fermentation rooms with rehearsed ease. But Ariano noted the armed guards posted near the shipping warehouse, the lack of real workers, the excess of paperwork signed off by foreign intermediaries no one had met. The estate was pristine, but the air felt wrong, too still, too rehearsed. The winemaker's son, Javier Ferrer, was more nervous, more twitchy. A former real estate agent turned reluctant heir. He lacked his father's composure and stumbled often when questioned about exports and visitors. "We sent to Milan, New York, Tokyo," he muttered when pressed. "But I don't deal with logistics. That's all outsourced. I just help with the accounts." Ariano quietly reached out to contacts in Interpol, requesting data on shipments from the estate over the past year. What came back stunned him. Crates labeled as rare vintages had been sent to known addresses used by criminal syndicates. Worse, tracking ledgers found in open customs records didn't match the vineyard's own declarations. He returned to the estate late one evening under the guise of sharing a drink. Don Mateo poured generously, his charm laced with menace. "Do you know what makes a good vintage inspector?" he asked. "It is the patience to let what is bitter age into beauty. But some bitterness never sweetens." His meaning was clear. Ariana was being watched. The estate was more than just a front. It was a sanctuary for the untouchable. That night, Ariano snuck into the fermentation wing, unlocking the temperature-controlled cellar with a code he'd glimpsed earlier. Behind barrels and beneath the stone tiles, he found a hidden stairwell leading into a room that smelled of mildew and iron. There, stacked in sealed crates, were more than wine bottles. He found sealed paintings likely stolen, weapons packed in false-bottomed containers, and packets of unmarked bills stamped with foreign seals. On the wall was a corkboard filled with photos and travel manifests, including one picture of Eva, circled in black. She had come close, too close, and so she was removed. As dawn rose, Ariano knew he couldn't trust local enforcement. Too many were bought, too many silenced. He uploaded the photos and data to a secure drive and sent them to a contact in Madrid with a single message. "This is fair, and this is war." But he didn't leave Rioja. Not yet. Because justice, he believed, wasn't just about revelation, it was about reckoning. And if Ferrer had turned his vineyard into a fortress of crime, then Ariano would make it his battlefield. The vines swayed gently in the morning wind, their roots soaked in blood no one dared to see. Inspector Luis Ariano sat in his nondescript rental car parked on a gravel overlook that offered a commanding view of the Bodega del Silencio estate. The vineyard spread below like veins across a wounded landscape, and the cellar beneath, where secrets festered in darkness, called to him like a wound yet to scab. The files he had extracted the night before were already encrypted and dispatched, but he knew the clock had begun ticking. Once Ferrer discovered the breach, retaliation would not come in the form of words or legal maneuvering. It would come swiftly, quietly, and without hesitation. Ariano had no illusions about the reach of a man like Don Mateo. In Rioja, influence was fermented like his wines, slowly, deliberately, until it intoxicated the entire region. The inspector could feel the gears moving even now, a machine greased by bribes and fear, winding up to crush anyone who dared disrupt the illusion. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers and stared down at the estate, wondering how far he'd have to go to break a man the law had failed to touch. It wasn't long before he realized he was being followed. Subtle shadows in his periphery, the same beat-up white van parked 3 times along different stretches of the highway, and a motorbike that always seemed to turn when he did. Ariano didn't spook easily. He had infiltrated rings from Marrakesh to Marseille, but this was different. This wasn't just about silencing a rogue journalist or outmaneuvering an ambitious inspector. This was about preserving an empire. The vineyard was the facade, yes, but the cargo within, the war relics, the stolen canvases, the laundered millions, those were sacred to men who killed for far less. He changed hotels, paid in cash, abandoned his phone, and checked into a dusty inn in the town of LaGuardia, under the name of an old suspect he once arrested. He didn't sleep much. At night, he replayed Eva's last message over and over in his mind, imagining her fear, her resolve, the point at which she realized no story, no byline, no truth was worth her life. And yet she chased it. And now he would finish it. Ariano's breakthrough came not from surveillance or official files, but from a local woman named Ligia, a seasonal picker who had worked at the vineyard on and off for years. She had seen Eva, recognized her from the papers, and remembered that she had spent hours not photographing grapes, but wandering near the north fence, where no vines grew, just old storage sheds and a rusted pump house long thought abandoned. When Ariano visited the spot under cover of a cloudy afternoon, he found what Eva must have discovered. Beneath a dislodged concrete slab, a storm grate led into a tunnel not listed on the vineyard's original blueprints. The air within was damp and fetid, the stone corridor stretching far beneath the vines like the roots of an ancient tree. It was a smuggler's artery, wide enough for crates, direct enough to avoid detection. He filmed everything. That was the moment he knew he couldn't just expose the operation. He had to dismantle it. Because Ferrer had built not a front, but a fortress. A sanctuary for criminals, a bank for blood-stained fortunes, and a graveyard for those who asked too many questions. It was in that same tunnel he found Eva's watch, cracked but unmistakably hers, engraved with the phrase "A la verdad sin miedo," to the truth without fear. He pocketed it gently, then slipped out the back way, returning to town just as the sun dipped beneath the olive groves. But word travels fast in small places, and by nightfall, he sensed the noose tightening. The receptionist at the inn no longer met his eyes. The bartender ignored his presence. Even the old priest in the plaza refused a greeting. Rioja had chosen its allegiance. The farers were not merely wine barons, they were patrons, protectors, providers. Ariana was a foreign cell, a virus the body intended to expel. That night, the silence was broken by a fire. The warehouse at the edge of Bodega del Silencio lit up in a column of smoke and sparks. The flames licking high into the night sky like tongues of vengeance. Fire trucks were late. The guards were missing. By the time authorities arrived, the blaze had already consumed whatever contraband the inspector hadn't documented. It was arson, orchestrated not in panic but precision, a purge of evidence. Ariana watched from afar, powerless. Ferrer had sacrificed a piece to protect the king, and Ariana's hand was no longer hidden. Then came the warning. A folded note slipped beneath his door. No signature. No threats. Just an address in Legrano and a time, 2 a.m. Against better judgment, against instinct, he went. The house was abandoned, a warehouse that once served as a bottling plant. Inside, amid the dust and forgotten machines, stood Javier Ferrer, sweating, anxious, reeking of guilt. "I didn't know," he said, immediately trembling. "Not at first. I thought it was just taxes, you know? Accounting tricks. But then the weapons came. The people. The threats. I tried to leave, but he stopped, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. He killed her. My father. He said she was snooping where she shouldn't. That he couldn't risk it." Ariana recorded everything. Javier handed over 2 ledgers, a flash drive, and a burner phone. "It's all here. Names. Accounts. Timelines. He's flying out tomorrow. Tangier, then Istanbul. If he goes, he disappears." Ariano nodded grimly. "Then he won't go." As dawn broke over Rioja, the inspector made his move. With Javier's testimony and the contents of the flash drive, he submitted an emergency indictment to the National Court in Madrid. For once, someone answered. A federal team was dispatched under the cover of a customs inspection. Ariano was told to stay clear. But he didn't. He returned to the vineyard one last time, alone. Don Mateo stood among the vines, pruning shears in hand as if nothing had changed. "You've come to watch the harvest?" he asked. Ariano approached slowly. "No," he said. "I've come to end the season." The morning sun in Rioja bled through the haze like a warning, casting the vineyard in hues of crimson and gold as if nature itself had joined the unfolding reckoning. Inspector Luis Ariano stood no more than 10 paces from Don Mateo Ferrer, who continued to prune vines with surgical care, his every movement deliberate, almost meditative. The old man didn't flinch, didn't look up. He had long known this moment would come. Not out of ignorance but arrogance. "You believe yourself a savior?" he murmured without turning. "But you're just another man feeding on the myth of justice. The system you serve bends when money whispers, and you came here thinking it could roar." Ariano didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch between them like the distance of a duel. In his coat pocket, the watch that once belonged to Eva Ortega ticked softly, a heartbeat of the dead urging him not to falter. "Justice doesn't roar," he said finally. "It waits. And today it no longer has to." A convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled up the gravel path behind him. Federal agents, uniformed in plain clothes, moving with quiet purpose. The vineyard workers looked up from their tasks and froze. Some backed away, recognizing the moment. Others simply stared, uncertain whether they were witnessing a rescue or a betrayal. Bearer turned slowly, shear still in hand, and gave Ariano a look not of surprise but resignation. "You'll get nothing out of me," he said with cold finality. "No confession. No tears. You think you've ended something, but you've only fractured it. Men like me don't fall, we divide. And in the division we spread." Ariano motioned silently, and 2 agents stepped forward. Ferrer didn't resist as they cuffed him. He stood tall, proud even, as if wearing shackles were an old ritual. The takedown was clean but incomplete. Within hours, news of the arrest made waves, first in regional media, then across national channels. Ferrer's name, once lauded as a patron of Spanish wine and rural economy, now shared headlines with words like racketeering, money laundering, art trafficking, and murder. Journalists descended upon Rioja like crows to a battlefield, asking questions that had festered in silence for years. And yet, the system Ferrer mocked still held its flaws. Within days, his lawyers, well-connected and serpentine, filed motions to suppress the evidence. Claims of entrapment, illegal wiretaps, jurisdictional overreach. The vineyard, meanwhile, remained operational, its board members pretending ignorance while scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. The estate's value actually rose. Morbid curiosity turned the wine into a collector's item. Bottles from Bodega del Silencio sold out overnight. But Arellano pressed on. With Javier's cooperation, they dismantled much of the financial scaffolding propping up the Ferrer cartel. Shell companies in Gibraltar, front operations in Morocco and Panama, silent partners in Lisbon and Lyon, all of it was mapped, traced, and targeted. What had once been a global operation was now a scattered maze of liabilities, each more desperate than the last. Still, not all of Ferrer's sins could be washed clean. Eva's body remained missing. The ledger spoke of her demise, and Javier's account left little doubt, but no physical proof emerged. The tunnels were cleared, the warehouse was excavated, and divers scoured the river basin miles downstream, but nothing surfaced. Arellano suspected the truth lay in the furnace of the old bottling plant, long decommissioned and discreetly remodeled by Ferrer years ago. What better place to reduce a threat to ash than in the heart of a machine built to preserve legacy? The inspector returned there once, late at night, standing alone amidst rusted machinery and soot-streaked walls. He lit a candle, not for ceremony but as an act of resistance. It flickered gently on a crate where Eva's name had once been etched in chalk, now faded by time and silence. To the truth without fear, he whispered. Then he left, locking the doors behind him for the final time. Months passed. The trial date loomed. Ferrer, still unbroken, sat in his high-security cell like a man preparing for a banquet. Rumors spread that witnesses were disappearing, that evidence was being lost, that judges were receiving anonymous threats. Arellano didn't sleep well. He kept his gun closer. Javier was placed under protective custody, his testimony still central to the prosecution. But the younger Ferrer showed signs of wear. Guilt had turned him gaunt. On the eve of his court appearance, he attempted suicide with a razor hidden inside a ballpoint pen. He survived, but barely. His voice, when he finally testified, was hollow, distant, as if speaking from beyond the veil. Despite this, the case held. The documents spoke volumes. Arellano's recordings, photos, and surveillance logs painted a damning portrait. Ferrer, once untouchable, was now a man whose empire had collapsed beneath its own excess. When the verdict came, guilty on 18 counts including conspiracy, trafficking, tax evasion, and accessory to murder, the gallery erupted in breathless disbelief. Ferrer merely smiled, as if the moment had already passed for him. As if, in losing, he had won some darker, deeper wager. The inspector stood outside the courtroom alone, the rain of Madrid washing the steps clean. A reporter approached him, notebook in hand, eager to extract a quote. "Is justice finally served?" she asked. Arellano looked past her toward the gray sky. "Justice," he said, "is never served. It survived. We carry pieces of it in our pockets and spend it when no one's watching." The reporter didn't quite understand, but she wrote it down anyway. Back in Rioja, the vines continued to grow. The new board rebranded the vineyard. Vina Clara, they called it after Ferrer's mother. Arellano never returned. He transferred to Seville, taking a quieter post in forensic accounting. He never gave another interview, never accepted the medals offered, and never told anyone about the envelope he kept hidden in his attic. Inside, Eva's cracked watch, Javier's original note, and a single bottle of 2008 Crianza from Bodega del Silencio, unopened, dusty, and stained with ash. Some nights, he would take the bottle down and stare at it, wondering what it would taste like. Not the wine. The memory. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. The Silence Beneath Naples. The year 2020 was supposed to be about survival. Italy, like the rest of the world, was gripped by the slow suffocation of a global pandemic. But in the southern port city of Naples, a different kind of contagion flourished. One older than disease, more tenacious than any virus. Organized crime didn't pause for curfews or masks. In fact, the Camorra, the ruthless Neapolitan mafia, adapted faster than the state ever could. As the world turned inward, they expanded outward, weaving their way through state contracts, relief aid, and the desperate lives of the unemployed like invisible serpents. And in the heart of this storm stood Inspector Adriano Bellini, a man whose disillusionment was matched only by his resolve. He had watched friends vanish, superiors retreat, and cases collapse under pressure or payoffs. But when the bodies of two young men were discovered in the crumbling quarters Spagnoli, staged to look like overdoses, Adriano saw through the performance immediately. The heroin was too pure, the scene too clean. These weren't addicts. They were messengers, and someone had silenced them. The victims, brothers named Luca and Matteo Rinaldi, were minor figures in the city's sprawling underworld. Runners more than shot callers. Yet their deaths sent tremors through the streets like a warning shot. Their family had ties not to the Camorra, but to an old Sicilian syndicate from Palermo, one that had been quietly trying to gain a foothold in the chaos of Campania, while everyone else was distracted by quarantine and confusion. This was not just murder. It was territorial, ritualistic, strategic. Adriano knew the pattern. He had seen similar killings during the turf wars of the early 2000s, when Naples burned under the weight of its own criminal ambitions. Back then he was still young, still fueled by ideals. But now, standing in the rain beside the covered corpses, he felt only the cold touch of inevitability. Crime wasn't being fought, it was being managed, and the managers wore both uniforms and suits. He returned to headquarters with a sick taste in his mouth. The captain barely looked up when Adriano dropped the autopsy files on his desk. Just another overdose, the man muttered. Too busy scrolling through a procurement report on surgical gloves to care about the blood in the streets. Adriano didn't argue. He knew the drill. If it didn't make headlines or threaten an election, it didn't matter. But Adriano wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing ghosts. And one name kept coming back from the dead. Riccardo I. Sardo Romano. Once a respected tailor in Vomero, Romano had transformed his reputation from clothier to kingpin in less than a decade. Using his shop as a front for a highly profitable micro-distribution ring in counterfeit luxury goods and pharmaceuticals. He had vanished in February 2017 following a botched arrest attempt, presumed dead or in hiding. But rumors persisted, and now, several sources claimed he had returned, quietly with a new face, a new network, and an agenda. Adriano began working the case in secret. Officially it was closed, chalked up to drug misuse. Unofficially he started pulling strings, calling in favors from forensics analysts, former informants, and even one priest who owed him for looking the other way during a charity scandal years earlier. The pieces came slowly, like ash settling after an explosion. The Rinaldi brothers had been approached by an unnamed associate weeks prior to their deaths. Someone offering a higher cut to switch allegiances and begin moving new product through Naples' most crowded districts. Sanitizers, medications, even forged vaccination cards. It was the perfect crime for the perfect moment. Everyone needed supplies and no one had time to question the source. But the brothers had hesitated, warned by their mother, who still believed in the old Sicilian code of silence. Omerta. That hesitation cost them their lives. Digging deeper, Adriano found surveillance footage, grainy but usable, of the alleyway behind a pharmacy in Kaya. Two men approached the back door, one of them tall and wearing a black scarf, the other shorter with a limp. The timestamp matched the last known sighting of the Rinaldis. Adriano enhanced the image and froze the screen. The tall one turned just slightly toward the camera. The nose, the jawline, it was Riccardo Romano. He had aged, lost weight, and changed his hair, but the eyes were unmistakable. Cold. Calculating. Empty. Like glass on a winter morning. Adriano printed the still and pinned it to the board in his apartment, which had become more of an evidence room than a home. He stared at it for a long time, letting the anger bloom slowly like a wound reopening. He knew what had to be done. Official channels wouldn't allow it. Romano had too many friends in the right places and too much dirt on the rest. So Adriano called someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Elena Russo, a freelance investigative journalist known for her fearless exposes on corruption, and for being the reason Adriano's marriage ended. They met in a parking garage at night, their faces half lit by the overhead fluorescence and the memories they didn't dare acknowledge. "I thought you were dead," she said, her voice a blend of sarcasm and worry. "Only inside," he replied. Then he handed her the file, photos, names, times, places. Everything he had. "Blow it open," he said. "Do what I can't." Elena took the folder and opened it, flipping through the contents with the practiced speed of someone used to betrayal. Her fingers paused on the still of Romano. "You're sure it's him?" she asked. Adriano nodded once. She closed the file. "Then he's already seen us coming." And with that, she disappeared into the dark. The next day, a Molotov cocktail exploded outside Adriano's apartment. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. They knew. Romano knew. The war had begun again. Not with bullets in the streets, but with whispers, leaks, and fire. And in Naples, fire always spreads fast. The morning after the explosion, Naples awoke as it always did, with the sound of sirens weaving through the narrow streets, muffled by laundry lines and prayer. But Adriano stood in the blackened hallway of his apartment complex, watching neighbors mutter among themselves, some in fear, some in quiet resentment. To them, he wasn't a hero. He was the reason fire came to their doorstep. This was Naples, after all, where silence was the most valuable currency, and anyone who disturbed that balance brought nothing but trouble. The fire department had already labeled it arson, but there would be no investigation, no arrests. Just another unsolved crime in a city addicted to forgetting. Adriano returned to his scorched door, stepped over broken glass, and collected the half-melted remains of a USB drive. One of several he had distributed in secret to Elena and a handful of others. The plan was in motion, and now the clock was ticking. By that afternoon, Elena's article had gone live, blazing across the digital front pages like a match dropped in dry grass. The Tailor returns. How Riccardo Romano rebuilt the Camorra during COVID read the headline, accompanied by shadowy stills of the surveillance footage and a detailed account of the Rinaldi brothers' deaths. She had pulled no punches, naming shell corporations, tracing financial links to government contracts, and outlining the quiet reemergence of a man long thought to be dead. The article exploded across Italy's underground networks before it even reached the national news. And as Adriano had feared, it didn't bring justice. It brought retaliation. Within 24 hours, 2 low-level prosecutors in Caserta were found dead in a car crash ruled accidental, though both had recently requested records connected to Romano's front companies. A small-time dealer known to have worked with the Rinaldi brothers was shot execution style in the outskirts of Pozzuoli. Elena's name began trending, but not for her bravery. Anonymous threats flooded her inbox, her personal data leaked, her apartment door defaced with red spray paint. Zitto o morta. Shut up or die. Adriano moved her to a safe house under a pseudonym, using one of the few favors he had left among the Carabinieri. It wasn't much, just a sparse seaside cabin once used for witness protection during the anti-mafia trials of the 90s. But it had no Wi-Fi, no cameras, and only one entrance. There, with only a battered laptop and the roar of the ocean for company, Elena continued digging. "Romano's bigger than you think," she told Adriano over a burner phone. "It's not just Naples. He's got people in Milan, Florence, even Berlin. They're running COVID relief scams across Europe. He's laundering cash through PP suppliers, ghost clinics, even funeral homes." Adriano felt the weight of her words settle on him like a second skin. This wasn't just a vendetta anymore. It was an infection of another kind, slow, invisible, lethal. The more they exposed, the clearer it became that Romano wasn't operating alone. Somewhere above him, above even the Camorra's internal hierarchy, there were political sponsors, foreign investors, digital architects. It was organized crime evolved, no longer limited to drugs or extortion. This was a business empire cloaked in emergency, made legitimate by urgency. Adriano followed the money trail as far as he could. One name kept appearing in offshore banking logs: Pietro Savo, a real estate magnate with deep connections in both Roman Parliament and several pharmaceutical import companies. Publicly, Savo was a philanthropist, having donated millions to hospitals during the peak of the pandemic. Privately, he had been investigated multiple times for racketeering, each time escaping charges due to lack of evidence. It became clear that Savo was Romano's financial architect, and more than that, his shield. If they were going to bring Romano down, they had to break the shield. Adriano knew that prosecuting Sabo would be impossible through legal means. He had too many judges in his pocket. So instead, Adriano made a decision that crossed the line he once swore never to breach. He contacted Fausto Marinelli, a former Camorra consigliere turned fugitive, who had fled to Switzerland years ago after a failed assassination attempt. Fausto had one rule: never speak to cops. But Adriano wasn't calling as a cop. He was calling as a man who had nothing left to lose. They met in Zurich in secret, in a cafe that smelled of rain and memory. Fausto was older, grayer, but his mind was sharp. "You want Savo?" he asked, sipping bitter espresso. "Then don't chase him. Undermine him. Make his investors nervous. Pull the rug." Fausto handed him a flash drive. "Everything you need to destroy his network is on here. But once you use it, you'll never be safe again. You're not exposing a man. You're declaring war." Adriano returned to Naples with the drive and gave a copy to Elena. Together they began leaking small pieces, anonymous audits, internal emails, bank records. Whistleblowers began emerging, cautiously at first, then with increasing boldness. Savo's empire cracked under the weight of scrutiny. And within a week, the European Financial Authority launched an investigation. Stockholders abandoned ship. Properties were seized. And for the first time in years, Romano found himself vulnerable. Without funding, without protection, he began to make mistakes. One of his couriers was caught in Ravenna, his phone filled with encrypted messages. A chemist linked to his counterfeit drug operation was arrested in Palermo. And then came the real break. A warehouse outside Salerno raided by health officials revealed not only fake medicines, but a torture room complete with cameras, bloodstains, and IDs belonging to 3 missing informants. The story turned from corruption to horror. Public outrage followed like wildfire. But justice in Italy is never clean. Just as warrants were being drafted for Romano's arrest, news broke that Pietro Savo had died of cardiac arrest in his home. No autopsy. No funeral. No investigation. It was a message as much as a mystery. Romano still had teeth. Adriano returned to his apartment, rebuilt but still haunted, and waited. He knew Romano wouldn't flee. Men like him didn't run. They erased. And if Adriano had made it to the top of Romano's list, he wouldn't hear the gunshot. He would feel the silence. And yet, deep down, he also knew this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about defiance. As the sun set over Naples, bleeding orange into the bay, Adriano poured himself a glass of wine, placed his badge on the table, and loaded his service weapon. Somewhere out there, Romano was watching. And so was he. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. Shadows Under the Mole. In the heart of Turin, where the mole Antonelliana pierced the gray sky like a needle through silk, Inspector Luca Martelli stood motionless, the rain soaking through his trench coat, eyes fixed on the body sprawled across the tram tracks. It was the third in 2 weeks, same method, same signature, same eerie message scrawled in red ink on a piece of sheet music tucked inside the victim's jacket. Harmony is silence in disguise. The media had already christened the killer the composer. Turin, a city of precision and elegance, had always hidden its shadows beneath art and culture. But this was different. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. It was performance. A grotesque sonata of death unfolding movement by movement. The victim, a local music teacher named Alessio Fiori, had no criminal record, no debts, and no known enemies. Yet his lifeless body, blood pooling beneath his shattered ribs, was arranged with the same disturbing care as the others. His left hand clasped over his heart. His right extended outward as if reaching for something just beyond the frame. Luca crouched beside him, the cold of the tracks biting into his knees, and studied the message again. Red ink. Same font. No fingerprints. The music sheet was from a Chopin nocturne this time. Last week it was Bach. Always classical. Always melancholy. He turned to forensic text swarming behind the caution tape. The sirens blending with the rolling thunder overhead. Have ballistics matched anything yet? He asked. A young officer shook her head. No projectile, no powder burns. Cause of death's blunt force trauma. Same as the others. Luca nodded grimly. Whoever the composer was, he was careful, controlled, and likely far more intelligent than the city was prepared to admit. Back at the Questra, the police headquarters, Luca paced his dimly lit office, the walls lined with case files and photos of the victims. All 3 men had some connection to Turin's classical music scene. One was a violinist in the city orchestra, another a piano tuner with a side business in vintage instruments. And now Alessio. A pattern was emerging, subtle but clear. The composer was killing artists, all linked by their shared mastery of sound. But the deeper Luca probed, the stranger the details became. Each victim had once been affiliated with the same institution, the Conservatorio Giuseppe Verdi, the city's most prestigious music school, and more specifically with one man, Maestro Carlo Ventresca. Ventresca had been a revered figure in Turin's artistic circles, until a scandal 10 years earlier forced his quiet resignation. Rumors of abuse, manipulation, and coercion had surfaced among his former students, but nothing had ever been proven. The charges disappeared. Witnesses recanted, and Ventresca vanished into retirement, his legacy smeared but not erased. Luca had tried to reopen the case back then, fresh out of detective school, and still naive enough to think justice could be forced. He'd met with victims, fought red tape, even lost a friend over the politics of it all. But in the end, the Conservatorio's board closed ranks. The press moved on. Ventresca walked away, and Luca had never stopped thinking about it. He lit a cigarette, a habit he'd promised to break after his divorce, and stared out the window at the flickering lights of Via Poo. If the composer was killing Ventresca's former students, was it revenge? Or something more perverse? Performance? Retribution cloaked in art? He pulled the old case file from a cabinet and scanned the names. Alessio Fiori had testified anonymously during the original inquiry. The others had too. All former protégés of the maestro. All silenced in death now, just as they were silenced back then. The thought made Luca's chest tighten. He'd seen vendettas before. Turin had its share of mafia ghosts and political whispers. But this was different. This was intimate. This was personal. The next day, Luca drove to the outskirts of the city, where Ventresca now lived in quiet isolation in a countryside villa that reeked of faded glory. The estate was overgrown, shutters closed, a garden choked with weeds. But music still drifted from inside soft piano chords, delicate and deliberate. Luca knocked twice. No answer. On the third knock, the music stopped, and the door creaked open to reveal a man in his 70s, silver hair slicked back, his eyes sharp and unsettling. "Inspector Martelli," he said without needing to ask. "I was wondering how long it would take." Luca raised an eyebrow. "You've heard then?" Ventresca smiled, thin and hollow. "My students are dying. Of course I've heard." He gestured for Luca to enter. Inside, the house was a museum of sound. Gold records, framed scores, photographs of Ventresca with dignitaries, composers, and presidents. But beneath the glamour was dust, disrepair, and something else, regret, maybe, or pride warped by time. Ventresca poured tea, his fingers shaking only slightly. "I assume you suspect I'm involved," he said coolly. Luca didn't deny it. "They were all your students. They all testified. That's more than coincidence." Ventresca sipped his tea and stared into the steam. The world is filled with men who think punishment can fix the past. But music teaches us otherwise. Sometimes silence is the only answer. Luca leaned forward. "You knew them better than anyone. Is there anyone who might blame them? A former rival? Someone who believed they betrayed you?" Ventresca set his cup down. "Inspector, when a student fails, who is to blame? The student or the teacher?" He didn't wait for an answer. Whoever is doing this, they believe they are composing justice. And like all composers, they begin with a theme. He looked directly into Luca's eyes. "But beware the coda. That's where the real meaning hides." Luca left the villa with more questions than answers. The composer had chosen his victims with purpose. And now the pattern suggested a fourth. There were still two other names on the original case file, both former students who had gone on to success elsewhere. One now lived in Berlin. The other, Sofia Rinaldi, had returned to Turin just a month ago to take up a teaching position at the Conservatorio. Luca raced back to the station, heart pounding, and pulled Sofia's address. He called her phone. No answer. He sent officers to the Conservatorio. Empty. She hadn't shown up to teach her class that morning. The storm outside began to worsen, and Luca felt a familiar dread settle in his stomach. The sensation he always felt before a body was found. He grabbed his coat, loaded his weapon, and headed toward the one place he feared might be next. The school. The Conservatorio Giuseppe Verdi stood silent in the storm. Its grand columns washed in the flickering glow of streetlights and lightning. As Luca stepped out of his car and pushed through the front gate, the wind tearing at his coat like fingers desperate to hold him back. He moved swiftly through the marble entrance, footsteps echoing through the cavernous hallways that once carried the laughter and ambition of musicians now buried under the weight of tragedy. The building's old bones seemed to groan with each gust of wind, and the soft of thunder played like a distant timpani in the background of the unfolding dread. He passed the portraits of composers and founders, their gazes cold and unblinking, and he thought of Sophia, vivacious, brilliant, and outspoken back in her student years, now returned like a ghost to the site of so much buried pain. The door to the main rehearsal room was ajar. Light spilled from within. Luca unholstered his pistol, heart hammering in his chest not from fear but anticipation. A force he had learned to recognize in this line of work as both an ally and a liar. He stepped into the room slowly, clearing corners as his eyes adjusted to the yellowish light cast by hanging chandeliers above. At the center of the vast room was the grand piano, its lid lifted like a mouth mid-aria, and beside it, lying motionless on the floor, was Sophia Rinaldi. For a moment he thought he was too late. Her hair was splayed across the floor like ink in water, and her arms were bound with red ribbon, echoing the color of the ink used on the previous victim's notes. But she stirred barely and let out a weak groan. Alive. He rushed to her, cutting the ribbons with his pocket knife and checking her pulse. Faint but steady. No blood. No obvious injuries. A sedative maybe. She tried to speak, but her mouth was gagged with the torn corner of a score sheet, Beethoven this time. He removed it gently, and she gasped in air like a diver breaking through the surface of dark water. He's here, she whispered. He's watching. Luca froze. He turned toward the mezzanine level above the rehearsal room, where rows of chairs overlooked the stage like an old opera house. A flicker of movement. The creak of floorboards. Without thinking, he gave chase. The stairwell was narrow, the air thick with dust and forgotten performances. He reached the mezzanine just in time to see a figure in a dark coat disappear behind a velvet curtain. Luca followed, adrenaline burning through his limbs, heart roaring in his ears. The hallway behind the curtain was tight and lined with forgotten props and stage decorations from past productions. Harps, broken violins, costumes that reeked of mothballs and history. The fugitive was fast but not silent. A crash ahead gave away his direction. Luca rounded a corner and saw him. A man in his mid-30s, lean and intense, with eyes that burned with something between brilliance and madness. He turned to face Luca, no weapon visible, only a conductor's baton held like a dagger. You don't understand the music, the man said, voice calm and steady, even as his chest heaved. They thought they could erase what was done, that they could walk away and leave the rest of us in silence. Luca raised his gun, steady but unwilling to shoot unless he had to. Drop the baton. Get on your knees. No. But the man didn't move. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. They were complicit. All of them. Ventresca wasn't the only monster. They played along. Sophia was next. She lied to protect him. She sang in his chorus of cruelty. And now you've ruined the crescendo. Luca's finger tensed on the trigger. Who are you? He asked, though deep down he already knew. The name came to him like a memory from a forgotten melody, Matteo D'Angelo. Another former student. Not a witness in the original case, but mentioned in passing. A promising composer who'd suffered a breakdown after Ventresca's fall, dropped out and vanished from the records. They said you left the conservatorio, Luca continued. That you disappeared. Matteo smiled. I didn't disappear. I was silenced, like all of us, but I found my voice again, and I composed something beautiful out of the dissonance. He took another step, and Luca saw the madness crack the surface of his expression. This wasn't just about revenge. This was obsession. I needed you to see it, Matteo said. The inspector. The audience. I knew you'd come. This was the final movement. And with that, he turned and ran again, darting through a side door that led to the rooftop stairwell. Luca cursed and followed. They burst into the open air, the storm now a full crescendo of lightning and rain. The city sprawling below them like an orchestral pit. Matteo stood near the edge, arms spread wide, baton still in hand. Do you hear it? He shouted over the wind. The silence? It's the only thing they can't corrupt. Lucas stepped cautiously closer. You don't have to end it like this. You've made your point. Matteo laughed, a bitter, beautiful sound. This wasn't a point, Inspector. This was a masterpiece. He turned his back to Luca and walked slowly toward the ledge. Tell Ventresca the coda is his. And then, without waiting, without pause, he stepped off the roof and vanished into the night. Luca rushed to the edge, but it was too late. Below, Matteo's body lay in a crumpled heap, baton still clutched in his hand. Officers and paramedics arrived minutes later, confirming what Luca already knew. Matteo D'Angelo had ended his performance on his own terms. The composer was dead. But the silence he spoke of now echoed louder than ever through the empty halls of the Conservatorio. Inside, Sofia sat wrapped in a blanket, shaking, trying to recall what she could. "He blamed us," she said. "He thought we let it happen. That we didn't do enough to stop Ventresca." Luca sat beside her, exhausted. "Did you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked toward the piano, where the baton had been placed gently on the keys like a resting bow after the final note. The rain continued to fall, muffled by the thick walls, and for the first time in weeks, Luca felt something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or the ache of justice long overdue. But something didn't sit right. He glanced again at the music page Matteo had stuffed in Sofia's mouth. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. A strange choice for a final act. Unless, of course, there was one more movement still to come. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. Shadows over Lazio. In the quiet pre-dawn hours of a late October morning, the city of Rome stirred under a heavy blanket of fog that seeped through the ancient streets of Lazio like a creeping secret. The cobblestones glistened faintly from a recent drizzle, reflecting the dim amber glow of the street lamps, which flickered hesitantly, as if reluctant to expose what lay beneath. Detective Marco Bellini sat behind the wheel of his weathered Alfa Romeo, the engine idling softly as he stared out toward the imposing silhouette of Villa Borghese, where the first call had come just moments ago. The message was terse, almost clinical, a high-profile disappearance at one of Rome's most exclusive art galleries. The victim was Elena Moretti, a prominent art curator known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue, last seen the previous evening at a gala held in the gallery's Renaissance wing. Now her car was found abandoned near the Tiber River with no sign of her, save for a single cryptic clue. A torn page from an ancient manuscript bearing an unfamiliar symbol, half burnt as if hurriedly discarded. Marco pulled his coat tighter against the chill, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on him like the centuries-old stones of the city itself. He wasn't new to cases steeped in mystery, but this one felt different, more personal, more tangled. Elena's disappearance wasn't just a simple missing person case. It was the opening act of a play written in shadows and whispers. A script that had been unfolding silently for decades beneath the surface of Rome's glittering cultural facade. As he stepped out into the misty street, the scent of damp earth mingled with the distant aroma of roasting chestnuts from a vendor's cart, grounding him momentarily before the storm of his thoughts surged again. His first stop was the gallery, an architectural gem that housed some of Italy's rarest treasures. A place where history and beauty danced dangerously close to greed and obsession. Inside, the gallery was eerily quiet, the usual buzz of art lovers replaced by a tense hush. The curator's office was untouched, papers scattered as if disturbed in haste, and on the polished mahogany desk lay Elena's phone, still buzzing silently with unread messages. Marco's gaze fell on the torn manuscript page pinned beneath a heavy crystal paperweight. The symbol, a twisted knot of lines and curves, seemed archaic, belonging perhaps to a forgotten sect or an underground society, whispered about in Rome's darkest corners. He pocketed the page carefully, sensing it was more than just a clue. It was a key. The gallery's security footage offered little comfort. The cameras around the Renaissance wing showed Elena arriving alone, entering the exhibit room, and then nothing. A 20-minute blackout in the system coincided perfectly with her disappearance, as if someone had meticulously planned every move. Marco's partner, Lucia Cani, a sharp-eyed analyst with a knack for decoding patterns, met him near the entrance. Her expression was grave but determined. "This wasn't random," she said, scrolling through the footage on her tablet. "Someone wanted her gone. But not just anyone. Look here." She pointed to a shadowy figure lurking near the gallery's rear exit, cloaked in a dark trench coat and hat pulled low. And they knew the security blind spots. Marco nodded slowly. "This feels like a warning." His mind raced back to the whispered rumors about the so-called Lazio Circle. A secret cabal rumored to manipulate the city's cultural heritage for profit and power. The manuscripts, the rare artworks, even the political connections, they all intertwined like strands of a sinister web. Elena, outspoken and fearless, had been threatening to expose them. Back at the police station, The interrogation room awaited its next occupant. Marco and Lucia sat across from an anxious art dealer named Vittorio Salvi, known to have close ties with some of Rome's most influential figures. Vittorio's face was pale, beads of sweat forming despite the cool air-conditioned room. "We're not here to accuse Vittorio," Marco began carefully, "but we need to know if Elena confided in anyone about threats or unusual meetings recently." Vittorio swallowed hard then sighed. Elena was digging into something big, something she said could shake the foundations of Rome's art world. She was afraid of losing her job, her reputation. But I thought she was being paranoid. Maybe she was right. Lucia leaned forward. "Did she mention any names?" "Not directly," Vittorio admitted. "But she did mention a hidden auction that takes place once every few years, involving pieces no one knows about. Items stolen or perhaps worse. She wanted to stop it, to bring it to light." Marco exchanged a look with Lucia. This was no longer just about a disappearance. It was a battle against a shadow empire controlling the very soul of Lazio's culture. And the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. The night grew darker outside as Marco left the station, the weight of the case pressing harder. He lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl upwards like the mysteries he was about to unravel. Somewhere in the city's labyrinth of alleyways, someone was watching, waiting to strike again. And he knew without doubt that Elena Moretti's story was only just beginning. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with rain, the kind that blurred the edges of Rome's ancient monuments and made the city feel like a fading dream. Detective Marco Bellini stood at the edge of the Tiber River, where Elena Moretti's abandoned car had been found, its sleek black frame coated with droplets that gleamed under the weak light. Forensics had combed the vehicle overnight, but the evidence was sparse. No signs of a struggle, no fingerprints beyond Elena's own, and no indication of where she might have gone. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, swallowed by the city itself. Marco's instincts told him otherwise. Elena was a fighter, not someone to disappear willingly, especially not when she was so close to uncovering something dangerous. Back at the precinct, the pressure was mounting. The media had caught wind of the case, turning it into a spectacle, and political figures were already whispering about potential scandals that could erupt from the art world's underbelly. Marco and Lucia worked tirelessly, piecing together Elena's last days from fragmented testimonies and cryptic messages found on her phone. One recurring theme emerged, a name. Corvo the Crow. A shadowy figure mentioned repeatedly in encrypted emails and veiled conversations. Rumored to be the mastermind behind the illicit auctions Vittorio Salvi had hinted at. But no one seemed to know who or what Corvo really was, a ghost, a code name, or a person pulling strings from the shadows. Determined to find answers, Marco reached out to an old contact, Father Angelo, a priest with deep roots in Rome's underground, known for his discreet knowledge of the city's secrets and its people. The church's ancient walls had witnessed centuries of secrets, and Father Angelo had a reputation for understanding those who lived on the margins, the forgotten, and the dangerous. Meeting him in the quiet sanctuary of Santa Maria in Trastevere, Marco hoped to glean insight into the mysterious symbol on the manuscript page and the elusive Il Corvo. Father Angelo examined the torn page with a furrowed brow, the candlelight flickering across his lined face. "This," he said softly, "is the mark of an old brotherhood, a secret society dating back to the Renaissance. They called themselves La Società del Corvo, the Society of the Crow. Guardians of forbidden knowledge, but also keepers of dark bargains. Their influence never truly died. It simply hid beneath layers of time and power." He looked up, eyes shadowed. If Elena stumbled upon this, she was in grave danger. That afternoon, Marco and Lucia visited the grand villa of Elena's closest friend and fellow curator, Isabella Ricci. The villa overlooked the rolling hills outside Rome, a stark contrast to the city's stone and mist. Isabella was visibly shaken, her usual composure cracked by worry. Elena was obsessed with the auctions, Isabella confessed. She believed they were not just about selling stolen art, but about controlling history itself. Priceless artifacts were disappearing, replaced by forgeries, and those who resisted were silenced. She wanted to expose them before it was too late. Marco noted the fear in Isabella's voice, the weight of betrayal that came with knowing such secrets. As they left, a shadow moved swiftly across the garden's edge, unnoticed by anyone but Marco, who instinctively reached for his phone to capture the fleeting figure. but it vanished before he could. That evening, the city's pulse quickened. Marco's phone buzzed with an anonymous tip, an address on the outskirts of Rome, where a secret gathering was said to take place. Under the cover of darkness, Marco and Lucia drove through winding roads flanked by towering cypresses, their headlights cutting through the fog like blades. The destination was a dilapidated warehouse near the abandoned industrial district, its facade scarred by years of neglect and graffiti. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the smell of damp concrete. Whispers echoed off the walls as a clandestine auction was in full swing, guarded by men in dark suits and faces obscured by shadows. Priceless relics lay on tables draped in velvet, ancient coins, Renaissance paintings, and manuscripts whose value transcended money. Marco's heart pounded as he scanned the crowd, searching for a clue, a face, or the elusive Il Corvo. Suddenly, a voice hissed in his ear, low and urgent. "They know you're here. You're playing a dangerous game, detective." Marco spun to see a figure cloaked in black, the edges of a crow's feathered mask visible in the dim light. The warning was clear: retreat or risk becoming the next victim in a deadly conspiracy. As they slipped away into the night, Marco's mind raced. The layers of deceit were deeper than he'd imagined. The Society of the Crow was not just a myth. It was a living force, orchestrating a ruthless campaign to rewrite history and silence anyone who dared oppose them. And Elena's fate was intertwined with this dark web. Back at the station, late into the night, Marco studied the connections, mapping out the network of players involved, from corrupt officials to wealthy collectors and shadowy enforcers. The puzzle pieces were jagged, but slowly, a picture emerged of a city caught between past and present, where power was traded like currency and trust was a rare commodity. As dawn approached, Marco lit another cigarette, his hands trembling with exhaustion and determination. Somewhere in the labyrinth of Rome's alleys and ancient vaults, Elena Moretti was fighting to survive, or already lost to the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. The sun had barely risen over Rome when Marco Bellini received an unexpected call that shattered the fragile calm of the early morning. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the message was unmistakable. A location, an abandoned chapel in the countryside outside Lazio, and a warning: come alone if you want to find Elena. Every instinct screamed at Marco to refuse, but the thought of leaving Elena trapped in the shadows, her fate unknown, pushed him forward. He knew the path ahead was a perilous one, a dance with shadows where trust was scarce and danger lurked in every corner. The drive was long and silent, the road winding through olive groves and vineyards bathed in the golden light of dawn. Arriving at the chapel, its cracked stone facade wrapped in creeping ivy, Marco felt the weight of history pressing down, the silence thick with secrets. The door creaked open with a reluctant groan, revealing a dim interior strewn with faded tapestries and dust-choked pews. He stepped inside cautiously, senses alert to any sign of movement. Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind him. Turning, Marco found himself face to face with a figure emerging from the shadows. A woman whose eyes burned with fierce determination. It was Elena. Her clothes were torn, and exhaustion marked her pale face, but the fire in her gaze was unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, voice strained. "They've been watching me, hunting me since I uncovered the truth." Elena revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. The Society of the Crow was far more than an obscure relic of history. It was a powerful syndicate controlling political and cultural institutions across Italy, ensuring their grip on priceless artifacts and historical narratives remained unchallenged. Elena's research had led her to documents proving the Society's infiltration into government offices and law enforcement, evidence that could dismantle their empire. But it also made her a marked woman, targeted for elimination by those who thrived on lies and silence. As they spoke, the chapel's ancient windows rattled under a sudden gust of wind, and distant voices echoed. The Society had found them. With no time to lose, Marco and Elena navigated the labyrinthine crypt beneath the chapel, where frescoes depicting angels and demons seemed to watch their every move. Their escape was harrowing. The cold stone corridors and hidden passages were a maze of danger. But the knowledge Elena carried was a beacon of hope. Outside, their pursuers closed in, shadows merging with the morning mist. A tense chase ensued through the narrow country lanes, the sound of footsteps and barking dogs closing the distance. Marco's training kept him one step ahead, his mind racing to protect Elena and secure the evidence that could bring the Society down. Finally, at a small farmhouse on the edge of a forest, they found brief sanctuary. As dawn broke fully, Elena handed Marco a flash drive containing her findings. Encrypted files revealing the names of corrupt officials, the routes of stolen artifacts, and plans for future operations. The weight of the secret was immense, but so was the resolve to see justice done. In the days that followed, with the flash drive secured and the story verified by trusted allies, the investigation exploded into the public eye. Raids were carried out across Rome and Lazio, uncovering hidden vaults filled with stolen treasures and arresting key figures in the society's network. The revelations sent shockwaves through Italy's political and cultural landscape, exposing decades of corruption and betrayal. Yet, despite the victories, Marco knew the battle was far from over. The Society of the Crow was a hydra, its head severed only to grow anew in darker forms. But with Elena's courage and the law on their side, there was hope that the shadows could be pushed back, that the true history, untainted and free, could finally be reclaimed. As Marco watched the sun set over Rome, casting long shadows across the city's ancient stones, he felt a quiet resolve. The price of truth was high, but it was a price worth paying for Elena, for the victims silenced by fear, and for a city whose soul was worth saving from the darkness. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. Shadows over Riga. The chill of early autumn clung to the narrow cobblestone streets of Riga, as Detective Ilse Janssens pulled her coat tighter against the biting wind. The city's medieval heart was draped in fog, the damp air mixing with the faint scent of wood smoke from nearby cafes. But beneath the serene facade of old buildings and ornate spires, something sinister stirred, a darkness twisting through the shadows of Latvia's capital. Hills had been called to the scene of a gruesome discovery in the district of Maskavas for Estate, an area known for its mix of gritty industry and faded grandeur. The body of a young man lay sprawled across the cracked pavement, his face frozen in a silent scream, eyes wide open as if staring into a nightmare beyond the grave. There were no immediate clues, no signs of struggle or theft, no witnesses willing to talk, just the cold reality of a life violently ended. Ilse had seen her share of death, but this case felt different. The victim, Mareks Kalninens, was no ordinary target. A rising investigative journalist, Mareks had been chasing leads that rubbed against powerful forces in Riga, organized crime syndicates entwined with corrupt politicians and businessmen. His last article, never published, had promised to expose a sprawling network of human trafficking and illicit trade running through the Baltic region. Now, with Mareks silenced, the fragile threads of justice seemed poised to unravel into darkness. Back at the station, Illinois sat surrounded by the buzz of phones and murmurs of officers piecing together the puzzle. Mareks' apartment had been ransacked, his computer smashed, and files missing. Yet in the chaos, a small, battered notebook remained, filled with cryptic notes and names written in a hurried hand. Among them was one that stood out, the Black Lotus. A name whispered in the underworld, associated with a shadowy criminal organization known for ruthless efficiency and a reach that extended beyond Latvia's borders. Hills knew that to catch Mareks' killer, she had to dive headfirst into the labyrinth of Riga's underbelly, a world where loyalty was bought and lives were currency. Her partner, Edgars, leaned over the table, tracing a map of the city with a finger. The Black Lotus controls the docks and the old warehouses near the Daugava River. If Mareks was onto them, maybe he found something in those places. His tone was grim but determined, the kind of resolve forged by years of walking the thin line between law and chaos. That night, under the cover of darkness, Ilse and Edgars slipped through the misty alleys near the port, where rusted cranes cast long skeletal shadows over the water. The air smelled of salt and decay, and distant horns of cargo ships echoed like mournful cries. They reached a warehouse with boarded windows, the only light coming from a faint glow leaking through cracks in the walls. Inside, crates stamped with foreign markings were stacked high, the silence broken only by the scuffle of rats and the faint murmur of voices. Ilse's heart raced as she pressed her back against the cold metal door, listening. Somewhere deeper inside, deals were being made, secrets traded in hushed tones. A glimpse through a crack showed men exchanging bundles of cash and packages wrapped in black plastic. This was no ordinary smuggling ring. These were the tendrils of the Black Lotus. But before Ilse could react, a floorboard creaked beneath her boot, and the men's heads snapped toward the sound. Panic surged through her veins. She and Edgar sprinted back into the night, shadows swallowing their escape. Back at the precinct, the danger was clear. The Black Lotus was watching, and they would stop at nothing to protect their empire. Ilse Numeric's death was only the beginning. The notebook hinted at a deeper conspiracy, involving officials in Riga's city council, and a planned shipment that could bring devastation to the city's already fragile streets. To unravel this web, Ilse would need allies she could barely trust, from street informants to disgraced politicians, anyone with a stake in bringing the Black Lotus to light. Days bled into nights as Ilse pored over evidence, each new lead uncovering more layers of deceit. She met with Inga, a former Black Lotus courier turned informant, whose fear was as palpable as her hope for redemption. Inga revealed whispers of a secret auction, where human lives were traded like commodities, a horrifying market hidden beneath the guise of legitimate business. It was there Inga claimed that Merrick's had planned to infiltrate, armed with proof and a desperate hope to expose the cruelty once and for all. But time was running out. The city's undercurrents were shifting violently, and Ilse felt the walls closing in. Phone calls she couldn't trace, shadowed figures lurking near her apartment, and cryptic threats whispered through back channels warned that the Black Lotus was closing its net. Merrick's had lit a fuse that threatened to blow apart the fragile peace, and Ilse was standing at the center of the blast. The night had deepened, and Riga's streets had slipped into uneasy silence. But Ilse Jansen's mind was a tempest of racing thoughts and fractured clues. Each new discovery pulled her deeper into a shadowy web spun by the Black Lotus. A network so intricate and far-reaching that it seemed impossible to unravel without losing herself in the process. The whispered names she encountered, businessmen, politicians, even law enforcement officers, blurred together into a confusing mosaic of betrayal. She sat in the precinct's dimly lit interrogation room, staring at a photograph of Merrick's countenance, his intense eyes seeming to challenge her to finish what he had started. The notebook she'd recovered held faint promises of hope, but was encoded in a maddening cipher, the key to which seemed lost in Merrick's chaotic notes. The informant Inga had provided a lead so chilling it haunted Ilse every waking moment. A secret auction held deep beneath the old Riga Cathedral's crypt, where victims were sold under the pretense of shadow business deals. The Black Lotus grip on the city was more brutal and systematic than Ilse had ever imagined, their cruelty masked by the veneer of respectable society. The knowledge ignited a fierce determination. She would attend the auction, gather evidence, and bring the entire operation crashing down. But to do so meant stepping into the lion's den, risking everything, including her own life. The following evening, disguised in plain clothes, Ilse entered the cathedral under the cover of darkness. The heavy stone walls echoed with the faintest whispers of history. But beneath the grand altar lay a narrow staircase winding into the bowels of the earth. As she descended, the air grew thick with dampness and the metallic scent of fear. Flickering lanterns revealed a network of tunnels where shadowy figures moved silently, their faces obscured by masks. Ilse's pulse pounded as she slipped into a corner, her camera ready, her breath held tight in her chest. The auction began with a cold efficiency, voices bidding for people, their lives reduced to price tags in euros, their fates sealed in whispered transactions. Ilse's stomach churned with a mix of rage and sorrow, but she stayed hidden, capturing every moment on film. Suddenly, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. A man with a scar trailing down his cheek, known in the underworld as the Wolf. A feared lieutenant of the Black Lotus. Ilse recognized him from a grainy surveillance photo Merrick's had shown her before his death. Her heart clenched. Exposure meant death, but retreat meant losing everything. In that moment, her presence was discovered. A hand grabbed her arm with brutal force, dragging her into the open. The room fell silent as masked men encircled her, their cold eyes studying the woman who dared to infiltrate their sanctuary. The Wolf's voice was low and menacing. "You think you can bring us down, detective?" Merrick's was a fool. "You will be no different." But Ilse was no ordinary victim. Years on the force had hardened her resolve. With a sudden burst of strength, she broke free and sprinted through the labyrinth of tunnels, chased by enraged men. She stumbled into a narrow passage, the sound of footsteps closing in behind her, until at last, bursting into the chilly night air, she vanished into the labyrinthine streets of Riga. The escape was only the beginning of a brutal game. The Black Lotus retaliated with calculated cruelty. Anonymous threats left at her doorstep, the disappearance of key witnesses, and a relentless smear campaign targeting her credibility. But Ilse pressed on, her every move shadowed by danger. She reached out to old contacts in Interpol and the Baltic security services, forming a fragile coalition determined to expose the network. As the pressure mounted, so did the stakes. A daring raid on a Black Lotus safe house uncovered horrifying evidence. Chains, forged documents, and ledgers detailing transactions that linked the syndicate directly to high-ranking officials in Riga's government. The revelation sent shockwaves through the city, but the Black Lotus was quick to respond with violence and intimidation, turning the streets into a battleground. In a tense meeting with Edgar's IL's trusted partner, the weight of their mission settled heavily between them. "They're not just criminals," Edgar said grimly. "They're predators who will stop at nothing. If we don't act fast, more innocent lives will be lost." Hills nodded, eyes burning with determination. "Then we take the fight to them, expose every secret, bring the city to light, no matter the cost." The final confrontation loomed on the horizon, a perilous reckoning between justice and corruption, where the fate of Riga's soul hung precariously in the balance. Ilse knew the path ahead was shrouded in peril. But with Merrick's memory driving her forward, and the truth as her weapon, she was ready to face the darkness and break the chains that had bound her city for too long. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe our channel.